Anytime you make a pruning cut, you're making a wound on a tree. So you really want to consider why you're making the cut, what impact will this branch have on the tree in the future. Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to Ask an Arborist Tree Care 101. My name is Alison Holets and I am a certified arborist, a tree climber and business owner here in Baraboo, Wisconsin. I wanted to do this presentation with the library because I feel it's really important to educate people on how to care for their trees. Trees are a really valuable asset to our community and to our world. And I think it's really important to help people learn how trees grow and how we can best assist them. Baraboo, Wisconsin is a Tree City, USA, but that registration really only applies to the city's trees. And I know that a lot of homeowners have trees on their personal properties, so this presentation will address how homeowners can best care for those trees. Tree biology. How do trees grow? Knowing how trees grow provides a good foundation on how to best care for them. For starters, trees are woody plants that produce their energy through photosynthesis, which takes place in their leaves. But getting a little deeper than that, trees like us are full of hormones that control their growth. They have two main areas of growth, upward in height and outward in diameter. Upward growth comes from the tree's apical meristem, apical meaning tip, and meristem meaning place where cells divide. The outward growth, adding to the tree's diameter, comes from its secondary meristems, located under the bark. The growth from the secondary meristems creates the yearly rings used to age trees. Also, I just want to point out that since trees grow upward from the tips of their branches, the relative height of the current branches will stay the same. And I noted that in the illustration with the dots. The green dot on the lowest branch stays the same height for the second and third year of its growth. So what that means is that branch you have been ducking under while mowing will not get higher as the tree grows. With a young tree, about 20 feet high or less than 20 years old, it's better to identify the lowest permanent branch, which ends up usually around 8 feet. And you want to remove any lower than that before they get bigger in 2 to 3 inches in diameter. As trees grow, the branches that develop are connected to the trunk by the branch collar. The branch collar is a pretty cool thing, and it is essential to the tree's ability to heal, and by extension, our ability to prune. Veins or vessels in a tree carry water and nutrients throughout. Within the branch collar, these veins do an S-curve before heading out to the branch. And I'm not sure if it'll show up on your screen, but on the right, the picture of the dead and debarked tree, you can actually see the vessels do a squiggle before heading out to the branch. Now, this oak tree is up on the East Bluff Trail at Devil's Lake if you guys want to try to find it for a closer look. This S-curve in the vessels is a great feature for healing wounds because in times of stress, like pruning, branch death, or storm damage, the tree can seal off the veins headed out to the branch. If the branch were to die, the branch collar is the part that grows out around the dead tissue, trying to seal off the wound. Within the branch collar, the tree also secretes special chemicals to help wall off the area to prevent decay. So you can see that the branch collar is pretty important to the tree being able to heal itself properly. Because of these great healing functions, we recommend that all pruning cuts be made at the branch collar. In the illustration on the top left, it shows the branch where the branch collar is located. It's basically the shoulder of the branch. Because of these extra vessels, the collar tends to bulge slightly compared to the rest of the branch, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes it's just a straight shot into the trunk. On the upper side of the branch, you can see pointed out the branch bark ridge, and that's a sign of a good branch attachment. As the stem and branch grow, the inner fibers layer on top of each other. This pushes and compresses the bark between the two, forming the branch bark ridge. On this slide is an example of pruning a dead branch at the branch collar. Since the branch has been dead for a while, it has started to shrivel and lose the moisture that was in it. And you might be able to see a crack dividing the live branch collar tissue from the dead branch. A traditional pruning cut on a live branch would be cut a little closer to the main trunk, but special attention should be given to the dead branches so you don't cut into this live tissue. Not all trees have good branch collars. When you see a wider branch union, one that is U-shaped or at a 90-degree angle, those usually have a good branch collar and are connected well to the tree. V-shaped unions do not have a good branch collar, and their connection to the stem of the tree is weak. All right, so let's do a little tree forensics. Here we split two branch unions to demonstrate the strong versus weak branch attachments. The picture on the left shows the branch fibers layering and fusing with the trunk fibers. That is exactly what we want to see, and it creates a strong, dependable attachment point. The picture on the right does not have those nice fibers between the trunk and branch. Instead, you see a dark line. That line is bark from the trunk and branch being squeezed together as they both grow. We call these types of branch attachments inclusions, and they are very weak. Instead of growing with the trunk and getting stronger, inclusions push and grow against it, making the branch prone to failure. Here is an example of what an inclusion looks like from the outside. You can see it has a tight V-shaped crotch, and they are very much two individual branches that are pushing against each other to grow. When both branch and stem are the same size, it is called codominant. Inclusions are very common in codominant trees. The picture on the right is a maple tree that has a very tight growing pattern and is full of inclusions. Maples are prone to inclusions, and without pruning, it is rare for them to have strong branch attachments. Looking inside the tree, the woody material is made up of sapwood and heartwood. Sapwood is the living tissue that conducts water and nutrients up and down the tree. They do this through tubes called vessels, much like the veins in our bodies. As the tree grows, inner rings of sapwood die and become the darker heartwood. Heartwood provides the strength and rigidity to the tree. The top picture on the left shows a larger pruning cut, about 8 to 10 inches, and you can also see a tear there. That's not very good. That wound will be hard for the tree to heal over. Exposing heartwood through a pruning cut like that invites in decay. Heartwood does not have the same resistance to decay, disease, and insects as sapwood does. Pruning trees when they are young sets them up for future success. You make smaller pruning cuts, the tree can heal faster, and you reduce the need for pruning it later in life. So how do trees heal wounds? A wound can be a pruning cut, a tear, or basically any injury that breaks the surface of the bark and exposes interior wood. When a tree is wounded, it tries to compartmentalize the injury by both physical and chemical means. It blocks off any veins that were transporting food and water to the area. It also walls off the injury from the interior of the tree to try to prevent decay from moving inward. If it is successful, it grows around the wound, sealing it off permanently. So compartmentalization is a big word that covers a lot of processes. And in the arborist industry, we shortened that to CODIT, which stands for compartmentalization of decay in trees. And so over the next few slides, we're going to do a little forensics investigation on a cherry slab. And this slab will show you a stub that was left by a pruning cut and how the tree compartmentalized that wound and grew over it. All I will be doing is looking at the tree's growth pattern and just interpreting that for you to show you how the tree heals. At some point in this tree's life, a stub was left, marked in orange, either by natural occurrences or by pruning. Because of how precise and not jagged the end is, I would venture to guess that it was a poor pruning cut. Either way, the tree was left to compartmentalize the wound. Looking back at the growth rings, I marked with a black line the approximate exterior of the tree at the time of the cut. So you can see that the stub itself wasn't large. It was probably about 2 inches in diameter and about 3 to 4 inches long. The first step in compartmentalization is to close off the veins in the branch collar that are supplying the food and nutrients exchange. You can see the growth rings of the tree where they start to turn to go out to the stub. That's the branch collar. I marked the approximate area with a green line. So now that the entrance into the rest of the tree is sealed off to the best of its ability. It is now in a race with decay. Will the tree be able to grow over and seal the wound before decay fully takes over? In this scenario, yes. However, you can see that decay did begin, as indicated by the darker area towards the tip of the stub. If you count the growth rings between the exterior at the time of cut to the current edge, it took between 17 to 22 years for the tree to fully compartmentalize a 3-inch stub. That is a long time. And this is just a very small stub that was left. Extrapolate that to a large 14-inch wound on a tree. Will it win the race with decay then? Maybe not. So just as a comparison, on the left is a proper pruning cut I made last year on a mature apple tree. On the right is a cut made on a walnut 2 years ago. They are both on track to be completely healed in another 3 to 4 years. However, keep in mind that healing times will differ by age and species of tree, but making a proper cut helps the tree heal as quickly as it can. The root structure of trees often gets forgotten about. It's out of sight, out of mind. But unfortunately, many problems stem from the roots, and once an underground problem develops, there isn't much we can do to help. The best thing you can do is preventative care. You can start by identifying the root flare of your tree. Like in the top right picture, your tree should get wider and flare out at the base. It's very common for trees to be planted too deep, which can cause rot and decay at the base. It also encourages unnatural root growth, which has a higher tendency to girdle or choke off the tree. If your tree does not have a visible root flare, try gently excavating dirt by hand until you find the spot where the roots start to flare out. Another threat to the root system of your tree is soil compaction. A tree's root system is actually pretty shallow. Most roots are in the top 12 to 16 inches of soil and no deeper than 20 inches. Try to avoid driving heavy equipment or vehicles over the root zone. Especially in areas like ours where the soil is heavy with clay, this can be very damaging. Compacted soil crushes the small root fibers and makes it hard to uptake water and nutrients. It also does not have any pockets of air left for oxygen or water to be stored. Mulch is a great way to help protect and care for your tree's roots. Mulch as far out to the drip line as possible to give as much protection as you can. Another common mulching mistake I see is the volcano mulch, where mulch is heaped up around the trunk. This can create many problems for your tree. Mulch holds moisture against the trunk, which encourages rot and decay. The preferred mulching method is the donut mulch. You want to leave space around the trunk, making sure that the root flare is exposed. The main benefit of the mulch is to hold in moisture, and now you are directing that to the areas that actually need it. Pruning. Is it necessary? Do we need to prune trees? Forest trees don't get pruned. But when you introduce risk factors, such as houses, playgrounds, garages, cars, that are going to be nearby trees on your property, pruning is the best way to care for your trees and mitigate that risk. The 3 main reasons for pruning are to address the risk, health, and structure of a tree. Trees with inclusions, having bark in the branch union, present a high-risk scenario when they are nearby houses, garages, cars, or playgrounds. Each individual tree should be assessed for the amount of risk they present. The best way to control risk is to prune your trees early and often. This helps your tree by avoiding more expensive and damaging pruning later in life. Pruning for health includes removing dead wood from the tree to help speed along its healing process. And structure pruning best happens when the tree is young, smaller than 20 feet or younger than 20 years. The tree heals quickly and its growth pattern can be easily manipulated. If you have a young tree next to your house, I strongly recommend structure pruning to help set it up for success. So on this slide, I included the tools of the trade. The middle picture, we have the hand pruner and loppers. On the right, we have pole saw and pole pruner. The bottom is a hand saw. And I included sanitizer in here as well, because a lot of people like to prune their crab apples or fruit trees, and those trees are really susceptible to bacterial and fungal infections. When pruning those trees, it's really good to sanitize, spray your tools down between cuts, especially between trees, to help reduce the spread of bacteria. And notice I did not include a ladder in the tools for pruning. Pruning from ladders is very dangerous, and I do not recommend doing it. If you want any of your medium or large sized trees to be pruned, call a professional. I want all the homeowners to stay safe. So we've talked a lot about proper pruning cuts throughout this presentation, but what does that mean? The pruning cut method I recommend is the 3-cut method. In the illustration, you can see that the first cut is an undercut, about 2 feet away from the stem of the tree. The second cut comes in from the top, and that removes the bulk of the branch. And the final cut, after you identify the branch collar, is just to the outside of that, finishing it up so the tree can heal completely. So now I want to talk about the proper pruning cut method that we touched on the slides before. I'll be removing this branch on the maple tree here, and anytime you make a pruning cut, you're making a wound on a tree. So you really want to consider why you're making the cut, what impact will this branch have on the tree in the future. So looking at this branch, it's growing out above the shed, and there's branches above it, so this branch really doesn't have a good spot to grow in. And so it's time to be removed. So this branch is about 3 to 4 inches in diameter, so it's a good time to prune this branch before it gets any larger, and we would be making a bigger wound on the tree. Alright. So this pruning cut here will be a removal cut. We're completely removing this branch all the way back to the stem of the tree. The first cut we want to make in the 3-step pruning cut process is an undercut. And we're doing this here, an undercut, to prevent the branch from tearing. All right, so I've got a pretty good undercut in, and then the second cut in the pruning cut process is coming in with a top cut. And you do the top cut until the branch starts to bend downwards. All right, so right now we have left a 1 to 2 foot stub just in case the branch did tear a little bit. This is a good fail-safe so that tear doesn't go back into the stem of the tree. You might be able to see it in the video, but right now sap is dripping out of the wound. That's pretty common for maple trees, especially in the spring. Trees are starting to come back to life, and water is starting to move up and down the trunks just in anticipation of the budding out and the leafing out in the spring. So the final cut that we're going to make here is right at the branch collar. So we want to identify the branch collar here, and it's pretty easy. Like we talked about earlier, there's vessels within here that start to make a bulge where the branch connects to the stem. And that's exactly where we want to make the pruning cut, is right here, right along the outside of that bulge. All right, so this is the finished pruning cut. The sap will drip out of the wound. It won't hurt the tree, but it might leave a dark black stain mark for the remainder of the spring. So here we're going to be pruning this elm. And so whenever you first look at a tree to be pruned, you want to look at its overall structure, size, and where its branches are. Ideally, when pruning, you want to remove no more than 25% of the overall branches. And that's just a good rule to follow, so the tree still has enough branches and leaves left over to make energy and feed itself throughout the summer and winter. So looking at this tree, it looks pretty healthy. One thing that I notice and I want to point out is this first branch union here and the branch aspect ratio. And this first branch, it's still a pretty good size, but because of how it's growing, I can tell that it will have a tendency to get bigger and try to overtake the tree. So what branch aspect ratio means is that lateral branches, we want to keep them at least 50% the size of the main stem. And we can help curb that growth by pruning them. So for this pruning, we'll use the pole pruner because it's a pretty small branch. We're not going to remove this branch completely, we're just going to reduce it. And what that does is help redirect some of the energy that the tree is sending to that branch. It redirects it into its main growth. And this pruning cut will be above my head, so I've got my trusty helmet on. It's always good to stay safe. So any pruning cuts you make as homeowners, wear a helmet. It's just good to keep your brain safe. So right here I've hooked the branch that I'm going to prune off, and what that's doing is redirecting the growth into the other side of this branch. All right, so with the pole pruner you can see it made a nice clean cut, and I would call this tree structurally pruned for the time being. It's always good to come back and revisit trees the following year or the second year after pruning to see if they need any more help. We took off probably about 40% of the leaves on that branch, and that's removing 40% of that branch's ability to make food and energy. So we've just slowed down the growth of that branch by making a reduction cut. So the next tree that we'll be pruning for this demo is this elm right here. So the first thing we want to do is look at the tree, assess how it's growing, and see what kind of pruning cuts need to be made. So looking at this elm here, the first thing I notice is this tight V-shaped crotch right here. And when branch unions are tight and V-shaped like this, it leads to inclusions. We talked about inclusions a little earlier in the presentation. What that means is that the two branches don't have a good connection with each other within the wood of the tree. There's bark right here in this attachment, and that creates a really weak union that could lead to problems later on in the tree's life. So what we're going to do is a removal cut. We're going to remove this entire bigger side of the tree. Normally, removing that much of a tree isn't advised, but because this is such a young tree, it's a perfect time to prune it, and we can really impact and shape the life of this tree by making this one cut. So to make this pruning cut, I've got my handsaw here, and I'm going to start with the 3-cut pruning method, which begins with an undercut. and then comes in with a top cut. All right, and now the last step is to make the final cut at the branch collar. Because this is an inclusion, it doesn't have that bulging branch collar that we like to see. So the best place to make a pruning cut is to find that ridge of inclusion and make your pruning cut about 45 degrees away from that. All right, and that one pruning cut is all this tree needs, and it really will help shape the tree's health in the future. The next pruning demo we're going to show is this tree here. What we'll be doing is a reduction cut off of this limb, and the reason we'll be doing that is because of its branch aspect ratio to the main trunk is getting pretty large. They're about the same, about 3 inches in diameter, and so that's something that we want to control when the tree is young to prevent a codominant tree. So what we'll be doing is making a reduction cut higher up on this branch, and we're going to be using the rule of thirds, which is something that I want to show you here on this example branch. Earlier I pruned off this side to show the rule of thirds. When you're pruning branches, you want to leave enough leaves and life left on the branch to assume dominance. So this branch will continue to grow, continue to thrive. And so you can see that this was the pruning cut I made, and this was the size of the branch that was left. And this is a good example because the branch that was left is about 2/3 the size of the pruning cut. So this branch would be able to heal that wound and continue living. So with that in mind, we'll look up at this tree. The branch that I'll be taking is this one right here, finishing up at this branch union. So same thing when we're pruning branches lower down in the tree with a handsaw, we want to use the 3-cut pruning method, and that starts above the union we want to be finishing at. That starts with an undercut, and this just helps prevent tearing. And then we'll finish with a top cut. And you see it did start to tear a little bit. That's okay. That's why we did it that far away from the branch union. All right. And then we'll identify the branch collar and finish the pruning cut. right. And so for right now in that tree's life, I think that's the only pruning cut that it needs. We'll come back and look at it in about 2 years as it grows to see if it needs anything else. Sometimes after pruning, the tree will react by producing shoots called water sprouts. This is a stress response. When you prune a live branch, you're taking away some of its ability to make food and energy. Water sprouts are a tree's way to gain some of that energy production back. Sometimes it happens if you remove too much of the tree. If you remove more than 25% of a tree's overall canopy, it might respond by really heavily producing water sprouts. But even if you just remove 1 or 2 branches, you'll usually see a couple sprouts come the next year or the same summer. What you do for these is just take your hand snips and cut them off as close to the stem as possible. They'll probably reoccur a couple times as the wound heals. They're especially prevalent in fruit trees, but just stay on top of removing them each year until the wound completely heals. All right, some pruning mistakes to avoid. The first one I want to talk about is leaving stubs. In the cherry slab that we talked about earlier in the presentation, that shows a great reason why not to leave stubs. It's real easy, just identify the branch collar and make the final pruning cut there. Another poor pruning practice is a topping or heading cut. A lot of times people will want their trees lowered for a vista prune, but it's a really poor practice for the health of the tree. It's literally when the top of the tree is removed, and not only is it removing the dominant leader of the tree, it's making a wound that the tree cannot compartmentalize. It's usually a death sentence for the tree. It may not happen immediately, but your tree will decline in health. In the picture, the walnut featured, the top broke out in a storm, and we cleaned up the break. It's not recovering well. Lion's tailing occurs when low and interior branches are removed, creating long, skinny limbs with branches just at the top. This type of pruning is mutilation of the tree. It creates a high-risk tree that is prone to failure because you have ruined the tree's natural wind dampening ability, and in its place, you left a top-heavy lever. Just a note, dampening is how the tree naturally reacts to wind stress to protect itself from damage. Sometimes in windstorms, you'll see trees swaying in the wind. That is the tree using its natural dampening ability. The only thing that we can do to help trees that have been lion's-tailed is slightly thin the upper canopy or cable the tree, which is what we did in the middle picture. You can see a slight black line. That's the dynamic cable we installed to help the tree dampen. Flush cuts are an improper pruning practice where the final cut does not follow the branch collar, but instead cuts closer to the tree. This cuts off the collar that we've talked about throughout the presentation, which is a crucial part to the tree being able to heal its wound. Flush cuts heal much slower than a proper cut and invite decay and disease. On the left, I put a red line denoting the angle the cut should have been made at. Flush cuts encourage a larger wound, which again is more difficult for the tree to heal. So with all that in mind, I hope you're excited to get out and care for your trees. Note that I do not advocate homeowners pruning their medium or large size trees. Please stay off ladders, be safe, and when in doubt, hire a professional. The ISA, or the International Society of Arboriculture, has a website called treesaregood.org, and I highly recommend that you go out and visit it. It has a lot of great resources for homeowners to care for their trees. It also has a link where you can find an arborist, and you can put in your zip code and it will connect you with arborists in your community. I also do recommend using that to find an arborist and hire a reputable tree service. They'll be able to provide you with the best information on how to keep your trees healthy for the years to come.